Hey guys, so good news, YGScope is back online, which means that Dueling Book data is available again, so I can do these meta tier lists by the data as always. And a big thanks to Sunny, who is the creator of YGScope, for maintaining that website and providing a valuable resource for Yu-Gi-Oh players. So in terms of how the tier score is actually calculated, you can always check my older videos in the description below. I don't really want to get too repetitive every month. And before we continue, big thanks to my sponsors as always, links and discount codes in the description below for Yu-Gi-Oh supplies. Now, with YGScope, there are still some limitations. There are some decks that the site cannot identify. The most notable ones being Rika and Scareclaw, which have seen some competitive success at YCS level events lately. And I did notify Sunny of these decks, so hopefully they'll be identified relatively soon. But for now, unfortunately, these decks will not be part of the tier list. So starting with the tier list for this month, we of course have Kashtira as the #1 deck. It is not only the most played deck online, but it also had by far the most YCS Top Cut representation. And in terms of the YCS Top Cut data for the scoring purposes, I'm only using YCS LA and London, only because YCS Bogota, the Top Cut information was not nearly as available. So anyways, Kashtira 60% match win percentage, very high. Usually you do see the best decks around that 60% mark, so really right along in terms of history. And then we have Spright, which of course has been seeing a lot of competitive success. In terms of YCS contribution, top cut wise, I did decide to sparse out the Tri-Brigade ones just so that the Tri-Brigade deck gets a boost in the score as well, since that was Tri-Brigade Spright. But anyways, I think people at this point now realize how strong Spright still is despite that elf ban, and it's one of the best decks right now. Very, very flexible in terms of being able to play hand traps and whatnot, and just really, really consistent and really, really solid. Can go for more kind of like lock kind of play with like Newman, for example, or you just play with like Melfi, or maybe you do both. So next is Naturia. More specifically, it's more so Naturia Runic, which has also been seeing a lot of competitive success. And you could actually argue this is maybe a score higher than Spright. Again, a really strong deck. I think the Runic cards probably will get hit on the next list now. I think it's shown that any Runic variant is able to compete, and it's really, really strong. And draw power, Konami likes to sort of tame that. Usually you see a lot of draw cards getting limited or banned, for example. So probably we'll see some kind of hit, but it synergizes really well into the Naturia cards, and just a really, really strong deck. And you know, Naturia Beast on its own might be just GG for a lot of decks too, but in terms of just being able to do all those disruptions, because the Runic cards can do pretty much everything, right? Negate effects, pop back row, pop monster, really strong. Another deck that you could actually argue, again, maybe is could be placed higher now, but it's been seeing a lot of success and really growing, is Mathmech. Really strong, another deck that can play a lot of hand traps, so it's very flexible. If it does lose a die roll and you have to go second and going first, even just that multifactorial set is like so strong, because you essentially get to, you know, send a card like on the field, like their hand, and also it has like an Omni negate essentially, and then you pair that along with like all the hand traps. Very, very strong, and really came back and played. This was actually categorized as tier 1 during Power of the Elements format as well, and then just completely disappeared during that Shizu tier format because of course, the Bestials and the Grave Shufflers, but now you don't see much of that. And the win percentage at around 60%, really insane, but honestly, in almost every format, Mathmech has always had a very high win percentage on Dueling Book. Of course, there are several players on Dueling Book who are very well known for this deck, someone including Sancti or Enzo Central, as well as among a couple of the others. So really, really strong deck, and under the right pilot, can do well in pretty much every format. Moving on to tier 2, we have Branded. I think this is also kind of fair. It's been falling down a lot lately, especially in terms of competitive YCS level success, despite its initial huge success at YCS Vegas, although that was a 3v3 event, which might have something to do with that as well. Of course, if you can resolve Branded Fusion, really strong. Gimmick Puppet Lock, also really strong, but can be very fragile as well. So I think this deck is a deck that has like a high variance in terms of, you know, how well you would do in a competitive level tournament, especially with a lot of rounds. Labrynth is another deck that has been seeing a lot of decline in terms of competitive success, but it did still get some tops, I believe, at YCS 250th. So it, despite being able to use, you know, the D-Barrier Eradicator, I guess, you know, back row decks in general, usually I find it's very straightforward to side against, so I find that they don't really last too long in terms of being the best deck. Eventually you do get blown out, and people sort of move on from playing those strategies. And then moving on to Swordsoul, I think this is another deck that's sort of been falling in play rather lately in terms of competitive success at YCS level events, but it's still a very, very good deck, right? And if you watch my cost breakdown of some of the top decks, Swordsoul definitely one of the most cost efficient decks out there, especially with that Barone reprint. And you know what? It's a kind of like a fan favorite deck. I find anytime I post the Swordsoul deck profile, I find it always does well. I think people really love this deck. A lot of people do, at least. It's very consistent, and so I think if you're sort of new to the game, or at least new to the competitive scene, and want like a pretty deck with a good budget but can also put up its own, Swordsoul is definitely one of those options. And then we have Traptrix, which is again another deck that, since the initial hype of that structure deck release, has certainly fallen down in play. I think online at one point Traptrix was actually like the second most played deck online on Dueling Book when this deck first released. Now that hype is kind of gone, and it's definitely gone down in play, but you know what, it still gets at least like one YCS top. I think it got one in Peru as well, which was right after that structure deck release. So you know, it's solid. I think the main issue is just going second with this deck. It's really difficult, but still, in terms of purely from a cost point of view, I think Traptrix is definitely number one, because you just need those 3 structure decks, and that gets you most of the deck. And then we have Tearlaments, and you know, I think people are still sleeping on this deck. I mean, I guess win percentage on Dueling Book, 48%, it's not that great, but it did top the recent YCS, and if you see it, if you are a good pilot, this deck is still pretty scary and can do a lot of things. And I think it's just more so the fact that it does require a big brain to pilot, and it's just no longer that tier 0 deck, so people sort of just move on and play something else instead. But you know what, if you love Tearlaments, if you know how to play it well, I'm very confident in this deck, and that you can still do well in this format with this deck. And then we have Dragonlink, which is a deck that usually sees pretty good play, and in terms of success, always been very consistent. Lately, it's been more so around that rogue range, but you know what? Recently, I was noticing on Dueling Book, some of the top ranked players, several of them were on Dragonlink actually, and I know it got at least one YCS top among the 250th YCS, and 61% win percentage, really high, and probably is one of the most reliable decks, and a good investment in terms of long-term potential, because Konami will always support dragons. Moving on to Rogue, we have Tri-Brigade, and again, I did split out that Tri-Brigade Spright as Tri-Brigade for the purpose of the score in terms of YCS top cut contribution. I think it's only fair. Yes, probably the best way to play Tri-Brigade now is with Spright, no longer, you know, something like Bird Up or a pure Tri-Brigade. Those are no longer tier 1 options anymore. But you know what, I think there's a lot of Tri-Brigade lovers out there, and I think it's still great that despite the elf ban, you can still play this deck competitively and actually see YCS level success. 48% win percentage, again, not that amazing, but you know what, I think if you're good with this deck, you'll still be able to pull off a lot of good wins in this format. And then Dark World, I believe it did not have any YCS top cut at the 250th YCS. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. Of course, again, this is not accounting for YCS Bogota, maybe something top there. And I think at least at regional events, it's certainly gotten tops as well. And I actually recently did a deck profile with Tristan, who finished day 2 at YCS LA with Dark World. So I think it's a solid deck. The only problem now is that because so many people are playing Droll, especially in the main, because of Naturia Runic, and as well as some other decks, Droll really can kill this deck. So I think it's a little bit rough, especially when Dark World is a deck that's not going to be really playing Call by the Grave and Cross Out for the most part, I believe, because it probably just ends up getting discarded with the danger cards. So I think it's solid if they don't have Droll, and you're probably in a pretty good position if you can get to go first, because you're just going to be solitaring for 15 minutes, and they're probably starting their turn with like 1 or 2 cards. Then we have Drytron, which again is another deck that's actually been seeing some good YCS successes now, at least as a rogue deck. And I think with the emergence of Drytron now, I think it's still cool to see, considering how absent it was in last format because of the Shizu Tears, and another deck that has a lot of fans. And I think it's cool that at least there's a competitively viable ritual deck even in today's age, despite the fact that it can be rather oppressive if it gets, let's say, something like Vanity's Ruler. And then we have Flunder. This is certainly a deck that I can't really say people really love. I guess there are certainly people that love Flunder, but for the most part, if you're just a regular, typical player, you probably don't like this deck. It had a lot of kind of toxic win conditions. At least Win Barrier statue is gone. But you know what? 58% win percentage is actually really good for this deck. And this deck actually had above 60% win percentage when it was a tier 1 deck. And it was, if I did a recent video, or not recent, maybe in a couple months ago, where I mapped out some of the most top decks in the past year's history, and Flunder really had the highest win percentage of them all. So it's really solid deck. It's shown that it can still get YCS tops, and probably a lot more affordable now than it was before. And then we have Sky Striker. I don't think it deserves to be this high, to be honest with you. Win percentage 44%. pretty dang low. But the thing is, it technically got a YCS top, but I believe that deck was more so Kashtira than it was Sky Striker, so that's up for debate. But you know what, it's a fan favorite deck. No matter what the format, it's going to get a lot of players running this deck, so that's why it always makes these tier lists by the data videos, because it has a large component based on how often it's played on Dueling Book. So you know what, I think it's still solid though. Definitely can't sleep on Sky Striker. You have amazing cards like Thrust that can help it play going second, but for now I think it's certainly not in that even tier 2 category that it was maybe a year ago. And then we have Hero, which is interesting because it's another deck, while despite not having a YCS top, always makes these tier lists because it's a fan favorite deck and it has a lot of people playing it, at least from the perspective of a rogue deck, relatively speaking. And you know what, I think it has a pretty decent win condition right now with, let's say, something like Dark Angel. You give it to your opponent. Kashtira, that already messes them up by having a card, having a monster rather, but now on top of that, it's gonna negate all your spells, so it's pretty strong against something like Branded. Dark Angel is also like FTK essentially, so really cool. And I think the only downside though is against like Shifter, for example, this deck will struggle mightily under that. So you know, you win some, you lose some, but at least for a rogue deck, it's pretty solid. And then we have Marincess, which I thought was kind of surprising that it got ranked this low. I think it should be actually higher than this. It did have some consistent YCS tops now in the last 3 YCS events, most of which were from Shannon Baxter, if I recall. And so I think maybe the reason for the score being a little bit lower is that on Dueling Book, at least, not as many players are running it compared to other rogue decks. But win percentage wise, 53%, honestly, really solid. I think for any rogue deck, if it's at least 50%, like, you're in pretty good form. And then we have another new addition to the tier list is For Hire, and that is For Hire Runic, which got top 4 in one of the 250th YCS with Dinkabui. So really strong deck with Runic and the For Hire stuff. You're honestly drawing so many cards on both players' turns. It gets pretty insane, and again, probably why the Runic cards will get at least some kind of slap on the wrist on the next ban list. And For Hire also goes along with Spright really well because a lot of their monsters are level 2s. So if you saw that deck play, it has a lot of synergies, and I think it's really solid, and certainly probably will increase in play and up this tier list as we move over in time, assuming that there's no ban list anytime soon. And then moving on to the final category, we do have Plunder Patrol, which, and honestly, I think any format, this could easily be categorized as rogue, but this month in particular, I found we had a lot of strong deck candidates, and it got categorized as other, but still, you know, with the Runic cards especially, it's seen some competitive success, or with Adventure Token as well. That was sort of how it was played previous formats. Win percentage, 47%, was not that high, unfortunately. I'm not sure if it's a hard deck to pilot. Someone let me know in the comments. I think that new Earthship is really cool, giving your opponent that token. Not only actually stops from you getting even lead, but also allows you to enable more of your Plunder Patrol ship plays as well, so I think that's really cool. And then finally, we have Punk, which has been falling in terms of ranking the last couple months now. Initially, it was actually decently high, I believe, at least near the top of Rogue. But now it's been falling. I don't believe it had a YCS top in the 250th. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. I know Gold Pride Punk was also kind of a thing right now even, although of course not a tier 1 or 2 strategy. But with the new Gold Pride cards that just got announced recently, perhaps it makes this deck better again. And I'm sure there's a lot of Punk lovers out there, or even just Synchro lovers in general, and this is a very solid one at that. So certainly don't sleep on it yet. I think there's certainly going to be more support, indirect or direct, for this deck to be also one of the better competitive strategies out there. So that's it for the tier list. Hopefully you found that interesting, and I'm glad that I was able to do this again with YGO. Again, a big thanks to Sunny, and also a big thanks to my patrons as usual. Really appreciate the support, and thank you everyone for watching, and take care, guys.